Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve. Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo.
We started this podcast to connect to Mad Men fans like us who pick up something new with every rewatch.
Be advised, this podcast will include spoilers, so we can talk about character arcs all the way through the final season of the series.
We're breaking down each episode of Mad Men, discussing the big and small moments, and posing questions to listeners so we can get your insights. Let's get started with Mad Men, C to Z. Today, we're talking about Mad Men Episode 9, Shoot. This episode was written by Matthew Weiner and Chris Provenzano. It was directed by Paul Feig. You might know him as a producer on The Office, Nurse Jackie, and Freaks and Geeks.
The episode opens with an idyllic scene in the backyard of Don Draper's house, where Betty and the children are watching as pigeons fly away from the neighbor's pigeon coop.
Yeah, this scene really establishes Betty as a typical suburban housewife. She's got 2 kids and a dog, and she's waving at the neighbors and tending to the plants, doing everything that's expected of her.
Matt Weiner calls it an almost David Lynchian opening scene, and I do get that vibe from it. The colors are a bit oversaturated. It looks a little too idyllic, a little too perfect, and we all know that that's not where Mad Men's going to find itself.
The next scene shows Betty and Don seeing the award-winning musical Fiorello. It opened in 1959 about a Republican mayor of New York. They're at intermission, and they run into Jim Hobart, who is at McCann, a competing advertising agency. You'll recognize H. Richard Green from Boston Legal, West Wing, and The Wonder Years. And here's a treat. His wife, Adele Hobart, is played by Day Young. She was on This Is Us, Melrose Place, and she was the snobby saleswoman who wouldn't wait on Julia Roberts in the movie Pretty Woman.
McCann is a large conglomerate competitor of Don's firm, and it's clear they have their eyes on Don as talent they want to acquire. So Jim Hobart is chatting Don up, ostensibly to get him to move over to his firm. The conversation then shifts over to Betty and her potential to model for them because she looks so much like Grace Kelly.
When the three of them, Don and Jim and Adele, are talking about the musical, it's interesting that nobody seems to be enjoying it except for Betty, who says, "I like the show, very gay songs," and the men are making jokes about leaving early. It feels like there's something about the role of a woman, and especially the younger woman, to be positive about what's happening at all times, in this case, how good the musical is. When Adele and Don go to pick up some champagne for them, Jim Hobart starts really pushing for Betty to come model for their agency. It's notable that this doesn't look completely sleazy the way that in a couple episodes ago we saw Roger. It does seem like this is a real ask. What did you think about this?
I think as a viewer, for me, it makes sense because it feels like the show is acknowledging something that we all see as a viewer, that January Jones is drop-dead gorgeous. She really does look like Grace Kelly. So when Jim Hobart is saying to Betty, hey, why don't you come and model for me? It feels legitimate to me, and I buy into it, that it's not just some manipulation, that it reflects the fact that Betty is so beautiful. She was previously a model, and that this could be a legitimate opportunity for her. So as a viewer, I buy into that concept.
At least it didn't feel to me like he was hitting on Betty. It does seem a little suspicious that the head of the company cares so much about who is doing the modeling for their Coke campaign. In this case, it felt like it's out in the open. He would love Don to come work for him. And if he can get Betty to come work for him too, then that seems like a real thing that could be helpful. Betty, however, is not jumping at the chance. She is obviously still very young and very beautiful. And she says, I modeled a lifetime ago. I'm retired. This is silly. And she really dismisses this whole opportunity outright.
I think she does initially, but it's clear a seed has been planted in her head and she's thinking about it. As we roll into the next scene where Betty and Don are driving back in the car from the show, they talk about it, and Don makes it very clear that Jim is aggressively seeking to add him to their firm. They both seem to acknowledge that there's probably a fair amount of gamesmanship involved, that Jim is trying to get to Don through Betty. At the same time, it's pretty clear that Betty's flattered that she was asked about potentially modeling again, and it feels like maybe a door that she closed in the past is at least been pointed out, if not reopened.
And I didn't track this across the episode, but as I look through my notes, I can see the number of times she said, I did model. I was a model, you know. I did have experience. It's clear that she's proud of this and, as you say, very flattered, and that she's definitely thinking about this opportunity. And she asks Don about his own and says, "Are you thinking of going to McCann?" And on brand, he doesn't say anything.
Yeah, it's interesting that he kind of dodges the question. So it gives me the vibe that at least Dawn is flirting with the possibility.
Next, we get this fun short scene with Betty and Francine. And Betty is telling her friend more about her modeling past, and she gets out some of her old outfits and models them for her. Betty is all sunshine and happiness when she talks about modeling. And it's nice to see her being so happy because we haven't really gotten to see that from her very much.
It does feel like a reminiscence of her youth. So Betty talks about the good times, about flirting with one of the designers in Italy. She gets the satisfaction of rolling out her outfit for Francine and Francine oohing and awing. So it feels like this is accelerating Betty's potential interest in this opportunity with McCann.
And you alluded to this a little bit ago, but how Matt Weiner has talked about, he uses the script to acknowledge that Dawn and Betty are gorgeous people. Like Francine here makes a comment that Carlton, her husband, calls you Grace Kelly. And another example is that later on in the series, somebody says they look like the couple on top of a wedding cake. And it does seem to make it more real that it seems true to life that even though this is specific to these actors, if the characters look so extremely beautiful, people in their lives would absolutely comment on it.
Yeah, that's obvious to us, but we're so desensitized because we're so used to seeing the beautiful people in our film and television. It's clear from Weiner's comments, he very much wants to acknowledge just how unusually attractive Dawn and Betty are in their formal wear, and that these are drop dead gorgeous people, that they don't look like the rest of us. They're not treated the same as the rest of us or viewed the same as the rest of us. And personally, as a viewer, I like that because it rings true to the reality of this situation rather than the more common opposite where we have to suspend disbelief and imagine that, oh, somebody's going to be really rude to Julia Roberts in a store or whatever it is.
I do have a small critique. Unlike a lot of the other supporting characters in the show, Francine doesn't seem to have much of a past or a future. She's just a foil for Betty to reveal her story to the audience in this scene. And I like the actress. I feel like she does a lot with what she's given, and she's very believable. And she definitely propels Betty's information forward. And she talks about this Italian designer that Betty modeled for. And she's incredulous, like, he made you all this and it was platonic. She says, no petting, nothing even. So it's understood that in her world, Betty trades her good looks for advantages that other people might not get to have.
I can accept that critique of the Francine character, but I would also say, look how far we're down the list of the cast until we hit one where we say, well, Francine could have done more or been more. To me, it's really sort of a backwards way of complimenting the series that we're so far down the list with so many interesting characters before we finally arrive at one, which is now, like you suggest, I think more of a prop or a foil to allow us to learn a bit more about Betty.
You're right. It absolutely is true because so many characters have so many thoughtful backstories. So you notice it in Mad Men in a way you wouldn't notice it in another series.
The next scene has Don in his office as the mail boy drops off a parcel for him. He opens it up, and it's a New York Athletic Club membership from Jim Hobart from McCann. It says, welcome to the club. Don picks up the phone and gives Jim a call. Jim Hobart is pitching McCann hard that it's an international company versus a mom and pop, and that someone like Don with Don's level of talent really needs to come to the big leagues.
Yeah, you can feel the hard sell that Jim Hobart is making. And it helps in this scene to see that in the ad world, Don's work is respected. It's not just within his own company, it's not just in his own head. This important guy really wants Don. And you get the feeling that he'd be very happy to stick it to Roger and friends as well. He's really forceful and he says, eventually you'll come here.
In the course of the conversation, which is over the phone, Don gets Jim to make the offer of what he's offering over at McCann, which obviously Jim doesn't want to do. He wants to do it face to face over a drink, but he throws $35,000 per year as a guarantee on the table, as well as working with some of the premier clients like Pan Am and Coca-Cola.
Next, we see Betty at the psychiatrist office in this really, really meaningful scene for her character. She tells us how she and Don met. She says he was just a copywriter at the fur company and she was on a photo shoot. She talks a lot about her history. So it's great to get the story of how they met. And she gets into some other things that we haven't really seen her talk about with the psychiatrist. I know in previous episodes, we noticed she didn't talk about herself. She talked about other things and around. She was evasive the way that Dawn is evasive. But here she really gets into some honest things. What stood out to you?
I think it was the fleshing out of Betty's relationship with her mother, because to this point, we know that Betty's mother has passed and she's missing her. In this session, we start to get the halo of Betty's mother drops because we realize that the mother has been critical of Betty and her eating, where she says, her mother told her she will get stout. And also the mother's expectations for Betty, which seems to be you need to look good so that you can go catch a man. And we can tell Betty has other ambitions or thoughts and feelings. So this relationship with the mother isn't perfect. And when the therapist says outright to Betty, you're angry at your mother, it's insulting to Betty. And she reacts hostilely because she doesn't seem to want to be confronted with that reality that there is hostility and anger lurking with her, lamenting and longing for her mother.
Yeah, this idea about being beautiful to find a man, this message that she got from her mother echoes what she told Francine in an earlier episode about as long as men are looking at her, she's earning her keep. And this seems to be at the heart of Betty's tragedy. She doesn't have any meaningful purpose. She got married and she was brought up to believe that that was the end. There aren't enough furs to fill the empty spaces in her life right now. And she seems a little rebellious and a little determined when she says smoking, I don't care why he gave me his card. And I just think, good for her. Go do it.
And also, Betty did make something of herself. She traded on her beauty to become a model. And then we find out that her mother denounced her as being a prostitute for being a model. So it does feel like Betty's coming from a can't win situation vis-a-vis her mother.
Yes. And she has a couple of really outstanding lines in this scene that I don't want to let go. She says of her mother, she wanted me to be beautiful so I could find a man. There's nothing wrong with that. You can feel that's just really embedded in her psyche. And then she says, but then what? Just sit and smoke and let it go till you're in a box. What a great line about her looking for meaning and what else is there. She also, I thought, was great. She talked about when she met Dawn, she says, he saw that I didn't like giving the coat back. It's always the hardest part. It gives you a sense of her values and how much she loves expensive things. She says that Dawn asked her out. He wasn't shy. And he had the coat sent to her apartment somehow. And she only had 2 or 3 more modeling jobs before they got engaged. And then she got pregnant. And then they moved to Ossining in the suburbs. And that really was kind of the end as far as this modeling dream, at least.
It's also a quick little peek into Don's past. Again, he's such a man of mystery. But by having been a copywriter, we get it emphasized that Don worked his way up through the merit of his work and his success. So he's come from a more modest place. And when Betty met Don, he was in that more modest place because now we sort of see him on the throne being courted by, Jim Hobart. And then later in this episode, Roger Sterling trying to keep him in the firm. So as much as Don's on top of the world today, we do get a little reminder in this Betty focus scene of Don's humble background and that he's worked himself up to this position as creative genius.
Yeah, great point.
The next scene opens in the boardroom back in the office, and the team is talking about Jackie Kennedy's Spanish language electoral commercial. And they're talking about how do they support Nixon. And you can tell there's concern. JFK's rising in the polls. Jackie's likable. You can see the sort of hostility on the team that they're fighting for Nixon here, but there are headwinds they're going against.
There are a couple of really funny lines in this scene, too. Pete on brand says about Jackie Kennedy, I recognize that finishing school voice. You can't govern and listen to that all day. Which, okay, thanks, Pete. And Sal has a comment, too. He says, I think women will hate her. Their better-looking sister marries a handsome senator, and she's going to live in the White House. I'm practically jealous. So it's funny how catty they both are in different ways.
That's a great line from Sal. Listening to the Weiner commentary, he points out how Dawn reflects the frustration that they might be on the losing side of this. And I think that emphasizes Dawn's apolitical nature. It's not about the politics. It's just about being on a winning campaign, another feather in the cap, another professional achievement. And they can see that's at risk now because Kennedy's performing much better than anyone expected at this point.
And they also say they're doing this work out of pocket. So he feels like this is a really risky gamble.
Yeah, my impression is it's less about the financial aspects and more just about the success and achievement and winning side of it. He wants to perform, he wants to win, and anything that doesn't achieve that is uninteresting to him.
The next scene is Betty talking with Dawn about wanting to model. She gives some supporting evidence and finally she says, I love this line for her. She says, I think it would be fun to go in and be that girl again, which sounds like the most honest reason of all that she wants to do this. And the last thing that Betty asked Dawn for about herself was to see a psychiatrist. And she was very shady about communicating that need. And here she seems to be a little bit more direct. And also, going to the psychiatrist doesn't necessarily seem to be making her feel better. So it's not a terrible idea that this might. And he doesn't seem threatened by it. Do you think he knows at this point? Spoiler, everybody, spoiler, super spoiler. Do you think he knows at this point that Jim Hobart is going to yank the rug out from under her?
I think he knows that that's exactly what's going to happen in the event he doesn't go over to McCann. But I also think he's shrewd enough to know this isn't the time or the place to stomp on Betty's dream or to even just throw cold water on it with that revelation about, Jim Hobart's motivations. So as I read Dawn in this scene, it feels to me like he's trying to be respectful and supportive of his wife. He's got concerns about, the job of a housewife, but he doesn't put up any barriers or obstacles in terms of Betty's personal ambitions or desires. He just brings it back to the normal household stuff and how will that function, which Betty seems to have thought through and has responses to, including the line, there will still be ham.
I wonder about his responsibility for knowing this, having some insider knowledge or reasonable predictability, and having her get her hopes up for this. I wonder if that was the right thing to do on his part.
The way I view it is I feel they've already covered this ground in the car. And I think there was full transparency there that Jim was chasing Dawn. It reminds me a bit of, these things that people we care about, and there's truths that we're sure they know, but do we need to remind them? Like, you don't really need to eat that cupcake, those extra calories, you don't need those. Or do you really need another beer right now? You've had a lot today, etc. It's not out of cruelty or neglect that sometimes we don't speak up. I think often it's just out of a sense of you've got all the facts and you've decided to close one eye to it and look at one side of the fence and ignore the other. It seems cautious and sensitive to that dynamic that, when people have hope and emotion wrapped in it, maybe you tread more lightly. And that's my interpretation of Don's character in this scene, because I don't believe he has any doubt in his mind that this is just a tactic by Jim Hobart.
Yeah, I can buy that. And it doesn't seem malicious on Don's part either, that he just wants to send her to the wolves and watch her be crushed either. I don't get that sense. It does seem like he doesn't want to be the one to do the crushing in this moment. And he says, I can't stop you from doing what you want to do.
Yeah, agreed. And if I put my cynical hat on and view it a little more cynically, is it possible that Don looks at it and says, she needs to go off that cliff, and having gone off it, maybe it will quell this hunger and desire for something else, or for her to get out of her lane as housewife and dutiful mother, which then solves the issue once and for all. He's highly intelligent, and I do wonder if maybe he's thinking it through several steps and says maybe this is the way it has to be.
No, I think that's definitely at play. I don't think that's a stretch at all. Next, we get a very short scene where Peggy is at work and she leans over and rips her skirt. Again, with the spoilers, just so everybody's aware, spoilers. I feel like I know that this event thematically in the episode is an excuse for Joan to have a private conversation with Peggy about her weight gain, but it is about as subtle as having her throw up in her garbage can before noon here, right? I mean, isn't this super obvious?
I think it is from our privileged position of knowing that she's pregnant, but I can recall other circumstances where young people put on significant weight in short periods of time, the sort of freshman 15 or whatever the saying is. I've seen that dynamic in my lifetime. So in a world where you're not looking around for it and probably assuming Peggy got pregnant by somebody when she seems so asexual and uninvolved in all this sort of romantic games in the office, I'm buying as a viewer that people would just assume, she's eating too many calories and not watching her figure. And that seems to be what the frat boys, conclude later in the episode. And it rings true to me that they would jump to that assumption.
It rings true to me that they would jump to that assumption as well because of the way that they view women in that time. I'm not sure as a viewer that it's as subtle as that, but maybe the first time through it is. It's that could be.
I try to remember the first time I watched the series and didn't know that she was pregnant yet. And I certainly noticed she was putting on weight, but I have to admit, as a viewer, I just accepted that.
And this scene moves us into this conversation between Peggy and Joan. Peggy is walking around with a sweater over the back of her skirt to cover the rip. Joan says, "Peggy, do you need to go home? The sweater, are you having one of those days?" And Peggy's response is very telling in a short amount of dialogue. She says, "It's not that. I don't think I can go home." She's focused on her work. She has work to do, and she doesn't care what she looks like here. She obviously wants to cover up a rip, but she's not going to go home and change because her image and appearance is not the focus of what she's trying to think about, right? Like everybody else is worried about image, but Peggy isn't. She's worried about her work.
Yeah, I love the scene because I just think it's great writing again, where we see what an alien Peggy is to Joan's worldview. And Joan's coming up with solutions based on perspectives and objectives that Peggy doesn't share. They agree at the end of the scene that Peggy's going to borrow one of Joan's spare outfits. But again, we just have the clear sense of this divide between Joan and Peggy's mindsets.
Am I the only one who thinks that borrowing Joan's outfit is going to be a lot more distracting than a rip in the skirt? Joan is taller and curvier. I don't know. That doesn't seem like a very face-saving measure.
It seems like a really bad idea. And as we're going to see, it doesn't fit properly. It is a big rip.
Yeah, we'll get there in a little bit. So next, Roger brings golf clubs into Don's office. He thought they were for him, but it turns out they were a gift to Don from Jim Hobart. So now Roger knows that McCann is courting Don, and he makes a very hard sell to keep Don where he is.
He does, and it's interesting what he says because Roger shares that he too thought of leaving the firm. How did that strike you?
I don't believe it. I think Roger has been involved with his business and raised to be part of the business. He goes through a whole bunch of reasons really quickly, and this just seems like a huge sales pitch. He talks about salary. He talks about big talent, attracting big clients. He talks about not being able to fire clients when you have stockholders. And then he goes, and who wants to start over? So I think this fake personal anecdote, like I tried to start over once, I think that's just trying to make it part of the exaggerated sale.
Yeah, it didn't ring credible at all to me. Roger is a Nepo baby. His father's a founder. That's the reason Roger's in here. And no other firm is going to poach or see any special value or requirement to have Roger. So I got the sense that Roger was just trying every door in the room to see if one would open to make traction with Don. And I think he does stumble across some items that are attractive to Don, but I'm not sure if Roger yet realizes how important these things are. He talks about as a public firm, Don wouldn't be able to fire clients, which will be a restriction on Don's creative freedom and having to toe the line and tolerate clients that he doesn't want to work with. I don't know if Roger appreciates just how important and valuable that sort of freedom is to Don. And Don is like a sphinx in the scene. He makes no reaction to any of Roger's arguments.
Yeah, Roger isn't shy about saying over and over, "My name's on the building." So he's very invested in making this business successful, and losing Don would harm that chance. I also do want to make sure we get our truth call out. We have a lot of them in this episode, actually. In a show obsessed with image, this line shows up almost every episode, and here's one of them. Roger says, "Big talent attracts big clients. We can make that happen here." And Don says, "That's true." But he seems very fake, as if he's going along to get along when he says that to Roger, like he's tossing him a little tiny crumb.
I also think one of Roger's strongest pitch items is when he says, "This is personal. I'm taking this very personally." And Don says, "Why? It's business." And Roger, as he walks out of the room, says, "Is it?" And I
He
think this
he doesn't even say it as a question. He says, "Is it?" And it's so cutting. He feels the sting of it in those 2 words.
But what I love about the writing in this scene here is I think it's exactly true. It is much more than business. On Don's side, where he's got this shady history that he's trying to keep concealed and wants to retain freedom of action and liberty and potentially pursue the hobo code if needed. And then same thing on Roger's side, where he's the Nepo son product of a founder here in this business that's a small mom and pop, looking to move up, looking to grow potentially, and really can't afford to lose their creative genius of the moment who they've stumbled onto.
And I do feel that Don enjoys poking Roger just a little bit, especially with the previous episodes where Roger obviously treated Betty so disrespectfully and Don disrespectfully. I think that Don is not immune to enjoying watching him squirm.
Well, and again, Don was a total sphinx with Jim Hobart to this point. He's not showing any signs of leanings with Roger Sterling either. So at this point, Don's holding his cards very close to his chest. I was also thinking someone like Don, who had to work his way up, isn't coming into the industry with connections. So there could be a reason that he's at a place like Sterling Cooper because he couldn't have got hired into a place like McCann because they would have had the pick of the litter in terms of candidates for literally all jobs in the industry. So here again is a connection that Roger doesn't hit on as, a reason for Don to stay, that Sterling Cooper gave him a chance or he saw his success and growth within Sterling Cooper. But I would guess that that's prominent in Don's mind.
It's not just Roger who's heard some of this news. The office guys are also gossiping about Dawn as they take us into the next scene, discussing what might happen if Dawn leaves. And Pete is really snippy. He's completely happy to have Dawn go. and Paul says, "Oh, you love him. Everybody loves him." And Pete is just like, "He's not 10 times better than me, blah, 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 blah." As they are having this conversation, Peggy walks by and they enter into a whole series of really rude comments about her appearance, judging her and noticing her weight gain, saying things like she's having a bad freshman year. It's terrible.
It's terrible. It's the frat boys at their sexist worst about Peggy. But I want to just quickly go back. Pete says that Dawn's not worth 10 times my salary, which is ironic because we know Pete's salary. So at this moment, Dawn is very much being courted for 10 times Pete's salary.
A couple of things at play in this scene, too. Ken says, "Belle Jolie, she did that." And that is the one comment about Peggy as a person and her work. So, to his credit, Ken sees that and notices that and comments on it. But here's Paul saying, "I'll admit she crossed my mind once or twice." And we know he kissed her in his office. So it's not just she crossed his mind. And then there's Pete, who thinks about her. He obviously does. So liars, right? Everywhere. And then Ken, where we thought, oh, nice guy Ken, he says, "It's a tragedy. It's like a piece of fruit that went real bad real fast, and no one ever got to eat it." He sees her writing contribution, but he also sees her as something to be enjoyed and discarded by men.
Yeah, just when you're in danger of thinking too highly of Ken, this episode really brings him back down to earth. And there's a later scene where even to a greater extent. So I think you're totally right there. They've all got their bruised egos here. And I think in some ways, just as Joan struggles to understand Peggy, I think these men struggle with this alien. She's not getting their attention. She's busy doing other things. She's writing copy. And I think she's an alien to them and they just put her into their sexist box. She needs to fit their preconceptions. And when she doesn't, well, it's that much easier to dismiss her. And the fact that she's turned at least one of them down and quite a serious fling with another one.
I'll also say that if you look very carefully in this episode, there are a lot of moments where it's not that Pete and Peggy have a scene together explicitly, but he is looking at her a lot. There are a lot of side glances in this episode. She's definitely very much still on his mind, even though things ended between them a couple episodes ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And Pete looks uncomfortable as Ken is mouthing off about Peggy. The next scene is at the McCann agency, is a gorgeous shot shooting across models that have come to try out for their McCann ad campaign. They're all looking very chic in 1960s. And then we come across Betty, who's looking a little behind the times in very 1950s. So it's interesting because January Jones is so obviously beautiful, but she's been dressed a little out of place. And then out of the back come Ronnie and Jim to scoop Betty out of the waiting room and usher her right into McCann.
Yeah, this is such a great writing detail. She's in a ball gown. She looks completely different from the other women waiting with her. And she might be beautiful and have experience, but it's been 7 years. I think that's about how old Sally is. And it makes sense that she's a little out of touch. And it emphasizes that she doesn't fit in this world as happy as she is to be there.
And if you're one of those other women seeing this gorgeous woman, but obviously in a dated outfit, thinking you've got a fair chance at this, it's got to be disappointing to see that she's got an in, and the fact that she's not dressed properly for the tryout isn't going to hold her back one bit. In fact, she's going inside, and you're stuck there in the waiting room.
Yes, I thought that too. What a lift and morale boost it must be to have the director come out and shake your hand and greet you and escort you back.
And I think this further emphasizes the point that this is all part of the courting of Dawn. It really drives home the point. As beautiful as Betty is, there are no shortage of beautiful young women in New York City for whatever modeling assignment you want. And even if they said we have to have a Grace Kelly lookalike, how many of those could they fill the waiting room with if they wanted to? So again, in our day-to-day life as the viewers, there's not too many Grace Kelly lookalikes walking around. But you get the sense that this is a commodity in the center of global commerce.
And one quick note, she is told by Jim Hobart, it's just a tryout. There are no guarantees. And she says, I told you, I've done this before. Again, as we're tracking that, I was a model. I do know what I'm doing. I have experience. She really wants to embrace this identity that this is who she is.
The next scene cuts to Harry and Pete scheming about Secor laxatives. They get into a little story about college, and it confirms their frat boy origins. They talk about a lark they did where they distracted from another fraternity house's activity by arranging their own to distract. This rolls them into a thought about Nixon Kennedy and about using ad buys to buy up space to prevent Kennedy from buying it, which would then help Nixon. It's really Pete's idea here, and Harry agrees that it's a good one. So they've decided to use Secor laxative buy-ups to seize the media market. I believe it's in Illinois from the Kennedy campaign.
Yeah, a couple episodes ago, we talked a little bit about this, about Pete and his talent and what he had going on. And this is an example of where Pete brings something to the table. It is his college experience and his frat boy camaraderie with Harry that leads him to this idea. But he does get to the idea, and he is working on solving the problem for the office. It's interesting to see Pete growing his business acumen in this short scene.
Yeah, and it's one of the first ideas that we see Pete is bringing something to the table other than just the Campbell name and breeding and connections for the company. So it suggests that Pete has potential down the road.
The next scene is at the Draper residence. Betty comes in to Dawn, who's watching TV. She says, "It was for me. I'm the girl with the cola." And I feel so happy for Betty to see her so happy to have something for herself, even if that thing is based on looks and probably is mixed up with a whole lot of judgment she carries from her mother. But she's only ever been this happy when Dawn is giving her positive attention. And she's been in a public performance thing like a boss dinner or something. And she says something honest to Dawn here instead of pretending. She says, "I know you don't like it, but I know you're a little bit proud of me." And he's honest too for a minute with her. He says, "Don't worry, I'm not going to ruin this." And let's face it, we thought he might, right? But he says, "I'm very happy for you."
It is a lovely scene, and I like for the Betty character, we can see how this success really scratches an itch she's had, fulfills a yearning. We can see how important it is to the character. So what started as maybe a dalliance or an indulgence, we can see it's much deeper and more profound than that. And I also like the writing in this scene as a lovely truth of this relationship, because we know the ways they've let each other down as partners, and we've seen some tense scenes up to this point. But this one is one where I do get a sense that Dawn is genuinely happy for Betty's success. He's making a point of supporting her and allowing her to enjoy it. They're both in a great mood together. I had exactly the worry you had is, what awful thing is he going to say to kill the mood here? And it doesn't come. Thinking about it, it really rings true to me that that is the kind of inconsistency you see in these relationships. Nobody's always horrible or always great. There's a real truth to the writing, and I think that's really respectful of the audience and the characters.
And it's not an accident, I think, that she turns off the TV and goes to give him a kiss. It's just them in the relationship for a minute, not the noise of other people's expectations or the television telling them what to think and how to behave. It's just them together, which is nice.
The next scene cuts to Betty working on the Coke shoot. We cut back to the kids getting looked after during the day. They're in the backyard with the dog, watching the neighbor's pigeons again. This time, one of the pigeons flies a little too low, a little too close, and the dog grabs it. The neighbor's alarmed, frees the pigeon from the dog, and then warns Sally that if that dog comes in my yard again, I'm going to shoot it.
And let's point out that these scenes cut together. Betty is posing with a picture perfect family in a Coca Cola ad, and her actual family is at home with a sleeping babysitter. We get Ethel sleeping on the couch, and the neighbor is threatening to shoot the dog if it harms his birds again. It's a juxtaposition here of TV life and real life in a TV show.
In defense of the dog, I think the dog is in the Draper's backyard. It leaps up. You see the hedge dividing the yard with the neighbor. So, in a court of law, I think you've got to acquit the dog. It didn't go into the neighbor's yard to get at the pigeon.
It had very good self discipline until the moment it didn't.
Maybe the neighbor should keep his pigeons out of Betty's yard.
You're anti pigeon. I can see it now. The next scene has Betty having dinner with Dawn, saying that everybody had a nice day. She's really happy with her work. She mentions that she's getting paid, and it feels like a new beginning for her. Everything seems fine until everybody's in bed, and then Sally comes in while they're sleeping, and she says she had a bad dream.
Sally talks about the bad dream and then relays the story of the issue with the pigeons earlier today. Dawn wants to go over and address this immediately with the neighbor. Betty says it's 2 a.m. It'll make it worse. She says she'll talk to him later.
So I noticed that Dawn here is upset and Betty is calm, saying that she'll manage it. So it's in her best interest now to make sure that her being away is not a problem for the family. She absolutely wants to smooth things over and not make any ripples. I noticed, though, and here's another truth call out. Sally goes back to bed and Dawn says, Sally's never slept well. And Betty says, that's not true. Dawn seems to be looking for reasons to be bothered by this situation, but let's face it, he has not dealt with the kids and their sleep nearly as much as Betty over their lifetime. And then Betty seems a little callous when she smiles and she says, did you see those big tears? I really want to get a picture of her crying one day. Instead of being concerned about Sally's worry about her dog, she thinks more about how Sally looks, which is probably something she inherited from her own mother.
I didn't interpret it that way. And listening to Weiner's comments on the commentary, it seems to me it's one of those parenting moments where it's something that happens again and again through childhood. And at some point, you'd like to have that memory or freeze a piece of it just because it is so prominent and true to the experience. So I didn't get that vibe off of it, but is it lurking there in Betty's character? It certainly could be.
I heard Weiner say that, and I definitely processed it. It's not that it's an evil comment from her, but again, she's focused on appearances all the time, and especially in her daughter, not so much of her son. And I don't think we can deny she's not thinking about, maybe a 7-year-olds get upset and they have nightmares, and maybe we don't need to stop the presses for that. But she's thinking about how the tears look on her daughter's face instead of what's going on in her daughter's head. And I think that that's notable.
Yeah, agreed. The next scene cuts to the team in the office discussing some of their challenges. It's Paul, Harry, Pete, Peggy, and Dawn discussing Lucky Strike.
I notice that in this scene, the guys cannot suck up to Dawn fast enough. So I guess they think that he's going to leave and maybe they want to go with him or stay with his success. So it's like a lineup. One of them says, hey, that Lucky Strike thing, that was a brilliant campaign. And Paul is like, it was like a supersonic jet flying over the market. And then Pete is next in line and there's this really long pause and he doesn't say anything. And Don looks at him and he goes, Oh, I was there. Great work. So he will step in and make the requisite nice comment only when basically forced to.
Which is very on brand for Pete, right? Pete is all about Pete, and anything that Pete does is for his own benefit. As they're sitting there, Roger and Bert walk in, and it seems that Bert's upset that somebody has snapped up a whole bunch of ad time for Secor laxative ads in Illinois and demands to know who's responsible for this.
Remember, this was Pete's idea, and he stays quiet. And Harry is like, yes, I know something about it. And there's this really long pause. And then finally, Pete goes, I bear some responsibility as well. He bears all responsibility. It was his idea.
It's a great scene for Pete because it is so on brand for Pete. And then it quickly gets revealed that Bert thinks this is brilliant, that they've snapped up the ads and it's worked exactly as Pete and Harry thought it would. So it flips from wanting to dodge responsibility and blame to wanting to grab the credit. And then suddenly Pete puffs up and, accepts the congratulations on behalf of the two of them. So a lovely scene of just everything I hate about Pete.
Roger has this great line. I didn't think you had it in you. And I mean that. So in a scene that's all about congratulations, that one is a great one. And then Bert and Roger leave, and Don looks at Pete, and it's flipped. And he says the requisite nice thing here. He goes, congratulations. And Pete handles it as badly as possible. He goes, Peggy, do you want to write that down? Don said, congratulations. And he stands up and he buttons his suit and he says, are we done here? So then Don puts it back in his place and he's like, no. So then he has to sit down.
It's a great scene where we've got Weasley Pete dodging responsibility, then claiming the credit, then getting all puffed up, and then being brought back down to earth. That the work on Lucky Strike continues. A really entertaining, quick little scene.
And the next one is quick as well. So Harry and Pete are laughing, thinking it was all going to go horribly wrong. And they call out the fact that Harry says, I thought you were going to throw me under the bus here. And Pete goes, yeah, for a second, I did too. And they laugh because it all worked out fine. Then Pete is trying to exert power again. His secretary comes in and he's pressuring her to stay and have a drink. She refuses. He says, when something good happens to me, it happens to you too. And she's like, I know that. And he goes, you should do something with that sourpuss. You're very beautiful. Again, who is he to make all these comments about how other people look or how they act? It's so, so, so horrific. The audacity to speak to somebody this way.
And in front of a large audience in the workplace, there's nothing Hildy can do. She just has to sit there with a straight face, and all she's got is her silent dignity in the face of creepy Pete just behaving terribly. It's a really striking time capsule of another place and time and what women were subjected to in the workplace. And another good reason to really hate Pete.
And it's a contrast because being overly rude and sleazy did oddly work with Peggy, but Hildy is not going to have any of that.
You feel really bad for Hildy in this scene and just shake your head that people were subjected to that.
In the next scene, Don in his office opens an envelope and he sees Betty's pictures from the Coca-Cola ad. He immediately walks down the hall to Roger's office and he negotiates a raise and says he's staying at Sterling Cooper. What'd you think?
I think that Don has a code of behavior, and I think Jim Hobart's crossed it. And with the sending of the pictures, Jim's just pushed it a little bit too far in terms of putting this under Don's nose that, hey, I'm trying to get to you through your wife. I made her happy. Come join me. He doesn't realize that what he's really done here is burn the bridge. I really feel this is the straw that breaks the camel's back and gives Don clarity that he is going to stay at Sterling Cooper. How about you?
When I first saw this, I was looking at the pictures and I was trying to figure out if there was something wrong with the pictures that I just wasn't discerning, because he seems displeased when he looks at them. And there could be a lot of different reasons why that would be the case. But I think with closer study of it, there's nothing wrong with the pictures. Betty did a fine job. It's just that Don, again, he's about himself. He doesn't want an employer involved in his home life or manipulating him like that. So I think it's a little weird that he says to Roger, I like the way you do business. Because Roger literally put his hands on Betty and tried to make out with her after inviting himself to their house for dinner not too long ago. Not great business. But I guess Don, with his oyster revenge, knows how to control that to some extent. So I think he sees that Jim Hobart wants to control every piece of him, and that will not stand.
I think that's a key distinction there. Roger really does cross the line after he invites himself to Dawn's house for dinner and makes a pass at Betty. But I get the sense this is a one and done where there's accountability. Roger has to apologize. The oyster revenge in the stairwell sort of draws a line under it. With Jim Hobart and this little trick he's pulled, I think Dawn rightfully gets the read that there are no boundaries and there never will be, and that this is the way Jim Hobart is going to operate, looking at all avenues, all fronts, all the time, and doing whatever it takes to get what he wants. And part of that is also, I think, wrapped up in compromising Dawn's independence and freedom of action. Because if Jim Hobart's got Betty in his pocket, what else is he going to try and control and shape and tether Dawn to his firm in a way that right now Dawn really is not tethered at Sterling Cooper?
Yeah, and in our last episode, the Hobo Code, where the hobo taught Dawn about the importance of freedom and being able to walk away, that ties very nicely into this second piece of this conversation between Dawn and Roger, where he says, if I leave, I'll go to something outside of advertising. And Roger is in disbelief. And he says, what else is there? And he talks about life being lived. I'd like to stop talking about it and start doing it. So this isn't a real life he's living yet in his mind then. And Roger calls him on it. He's like, you're the kind of man who'd want to die in the middle of a pitch. But Dawn insists he wants to do something else. And already it's hard for us to imagine him throwing away this thing that he's so good at doing.
I also interpreted it as a gentleman's agreement between Dawn and Roger. In return for not having a contract tethering Dawn to Sterling Cooper, the non-compete, Roger's going to accept a gentleman's promise from Dawn that he won't go to a competitor, which is the primary reason you have that non-compete clause in a contract. Dawn gets total freedom and he can walk away anytime except, I guess legally he could still move to a competitor, but he's made a gentleman's commitment not to do so. And in return, Roger gets that commitment that he will never do that and he'll only leave advertising 100%. So it really does feel like both sides get something that's valuable and useful to them. It might not be optimal for Sterling Cooper, but I think it locks down their premier creative talent in a way that Roger could lean on this gentleman's agreement. And I would also say, let's not forget that Dawn leverages up his salary to $45K a year here. So it's a very significant jump over what Jim Hobart promised him. And Roger agrees to it without any sort of hesitation and clinks the glass with the cheers to consummate that agreement.
I wanted to say something about that piece too. It's such a quick back and forth, and I love how witty it is. So Roger, for whatever reason, is eating Jell-O in his office, which I also find really funny. He says, well, I might ask you to take me with you. And Roger says to Dawn, so he's joking about this thing that would be horrible. And Dawn says, definitively now, he's been so evasive, I see no reason to leave. Or maybe I see $1 million. Roger's like, $1 million? Is that what it's going to cost me? I was thinking like 40. And Dawn goes, 45 is good. so, so just this quick back and forth, they come to this agreement and toast. And it's a familiar relationship that's certainly fraught with trouble, but you do see, I think, I don't know, do you see affection between them?
I think that's a great observation. And I was wondering, does this mark the moment where this employer-employee relationship is starting to shift now into a genuine friendship and connection between Roger and Dawn?
That's not my double dip question for our listeners today, but I do have a big overall question about whether or not Dawn has friends. And I do wonder whether or not Dawn and Roger have a genuine friendship. And I think it really walks the line with a lot of different pieces of evidence. So that's something to keep an eye on, I think, as we go through the show.
The next scene is Dawn calling back Jim Hobart. Jim's continuing with the hard sell, saying that your wife is here with us. Why don't you join me? Jim asks if it's about the money, saying he must have misjudged Dawn if it is about the money. And Dawn says to him, it wasn't a big league move, this play with his wife. And I think at that moment, it's very clear to Jim Hobart, he's failed to lure Dawn over.
It's not clear to me why Betty's job has to end. He says, okay, it's a pity to lose both of you. And Dawn knew that would happen. But I don't really understand why it has to be that way if, in fact, she did good work, which I think, again, is a little bit confusing about the pictures. So maybe it just underscores what a snake Jim Hobart is, because is he sticking it into Dawn like, okay, well, if we can't have you, then your wife doesn't get her pictures with us?
Again, I think it goes back to the point that there's nothing wrong with Betty's pictures or 100 other models who could have been in those pictures. So this has always and all along been a play for Dawn, and it would be a perk of him working at McCann that Betty would have her modeling career and could be doing things for McCann, not far from Dawn's awareness or, scrutiny of Dawn's coworkers. The fact that it all tumbles in as soon as the courtship with Dawn is over suggests to me it was never anything more than a tactic. And in fact, it's nothing personal against Betty or her work. She was a means to an end, not an end.
This next scene between Joan and Peggy in the break room, I love scenes with Joan and Peggy, I really do. I wish they got along more often than they do. Here again, there's some friction. Joan says Peggy is hiding a very attractive girl under too much lunch. Again, we have all these people judging women for their appearance, and Joan is part of that group. Peggy pushes back. She says, I'm the first girl to do any writing since the war. And Joan is not impressed by that argument. She says, oh, I thought you were writing to impress Paul. So again, the only reason you would do something is to please a man. She goes further and says that Peggy's not a threat to clients' wives. She doesn't look attractive. I don't think she's saying any of this to be cruel. I think for her, it's an important data point to support her argument in favor of changing Peggy's behavior. Then Peggy comes back to Joan and she says, I know what men think of you, that you're looking for a husband and you're fun, and not in that order. And she looks right in her eyes. And that's new for Peggy to push back at Joan like that.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think these are great scenes, extremely well written, very well acted. And again, it's the two aliens talking to each other. And Joan is so confident and assured that she knows what's best for Peggy, what Peggy should want, and her job is to illuminate that and get Peggy on the track. And now Peggy has brought her up short and made it very clear that that's not what she wants, that Peggy's not the girl that Joan thinks she is. It's just a delicious scene as they stare each other down on this. And again, I love the end when Peggy says to Joan, you think you're being helpful. And it's part observation, part statement, but it's just so well done. And you can see Joan's reaction is, yeah, like, absolutely, I'm trying to be helpful. Why is it you wouldn't accept my help?
And she smiles and says she's going home. She's just walking away from that whole mindset. She's not falling for that. She's not buying into that. She walks away from it, which is great. Another thing about this scene is that Joan says there's no money in virginity. So it's all transactional to her, just like Betty. So you stay pretty and you catch a man who supports you financially. And the prettier you are, the more financially equipped you can be. So to your point about her worldview, it couldn't be stronger. And yet you probably wouldn't compare Joan and Betty, but they think very similarly in many ways.
And then another interesting thing too, when Peggy says back to Joan, I'm not a virgin, it's kind of mind blowing to Joan because Peggy has so clearly not partaken in the sexual hijinks of the office, at least to Joan's knowledge at this point, and is not showing any interest. And they've just had this, disagreement or misunderstanding, whatever we want to call it, about where Peggy's ambition should lie. But then the fact that Peggy's alluding to some sort of sexual activity outside of the office, and again, I think just indirectly saying to Joan, you don't know me, you don't know about my life, and there are many aspects of it where you're completely wrong about it. So I just, again, love the acting, love the writing here. It's so on point.
And I think as an audience, we're cheering for Peggy to turn that system on its head too, because it's been so painful for so many of our characters in this episode to have this entrenched system focusing on what women look like and whether or not they appeal to men.
Yeah, I totally agree. I find myself as a viewer rooting for Peggy, especially after watching the humiliation of Hildy, and there's nothing she can do about it.
The next one is a really rough scene for Betty. The commercial director tells her that the client is going in another direction for the campaign. Here's our third truth call out for the episode. He says, at least you got some good new pictures for your modeling book, which again is evidence that proves her pictures are good. And she says softly, that's true. And she tries not to cry, and it's so tragic, the look on her face. and he takes pity on her. You know, he's part of the machine, but he stops and he says, "Oh, honey, it has nothing to do with you." And it doesn't, and that's the problem, right? She's not the star. It's all a manipulation of Dawn, but the rejection hurts anyway.
I don't think January Jones gets as much credit for her acting as some of the other cast members, but this scene is really her at her best as she tries to hold it together as they're removing the jewelry from her from the shoot. And it's just that perfectly acted balance between holding it together and starting to crumble and break down. And it's really heartrending. And I think that emotion that's coming through there is a credit to January Jones's work in the scene.
Janie Bryant on the DVD commentary says that in this particular shot, they dressed her and did her hair so that she would look most like Grace Kelly. And then remember in the scene with Betty in the psychiatrist's office, she said that giving the clothes back as a model was the hardest part. So here are the tears, and the assistant is literally removing the necklace and earrings from her. You know, she's giving that away. Now this dream is over again, and she's not that girl anymore. It's so tragic.
Yeah, and Matt Weiner says that they wanted to make the firing as painful as possible. And I don't think the brutality of is in the writing of it. It's in that acting and just that emotional pain on Betty's face as this dream is snuffed out for her.
Yeah, the woman is literally taking away the trappings of her dream, and there's nothing left anymore.
We cut back to the office, and the frat boys are drinking together. Pete sees Peggy leaving. So, getting back to your point about how he's keeping his eye on her, the rest of the frat boys notice her, and then they start to say their rude, sexist comments. Interestingly, in this scene, the one who's saying the rudest, most frequent comments is Ken. She's a lobster. All the meat is in the tail. This whole time, Pete is just fuming and ends up sucker punching Ken. What did you think of that?
I feel like this seems like a huge tell on Pete's feelings about Peggy. So it seems like the kind of thing that they all do all the time. So I feel like the other guys would have a reaction to him punching him for saying that. And you can see them, they're surprised. And I understand that Pete's action might be more about his own feelings of inadequacy rather than protecting Peggy's reputation. But I think that it would cause them to wonder about Pete and Peggy. And to our knowledge, nobody else knows about that. So I do think this is a huge giveaway when he does this. And I love that they're just punching each other and Don and Roger walk past it and completely ignore it. Like, drop you at the station? Sure, sounds good. They leave and they just keep punching each other.
I take your point about, why is Pete punching him? But I like the way the scene is written because they are gobsmacked. There's no known reason why suddenly Pete is going to sock Kenny here. And clearly he's angry. So I like their puzzlement as they're trying to pull them apart. And you can just see the puzzlement on their faces as to where did this come from? And then Ken, the subject of the punch, is similarly confused. Just, Campbell, what's gotten into you? Where does this come from? Why do you think Pete punches Kenny?
I think it's a nice idea to think that Pete is being chivalrous and doing it on Peggy's behalf. But he's been so rude and cold to her. And even though I think he looks at her and he thinks about her, I don't think he does things for other people's benefit so often. I think that it's uncomfortable for him to know that he's been with her and to have somebody making a critique of that, even if they don't realize it's criticizing Pete.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And in the commentary, Weiner confirms that Pete is not so much defending Peggy's honor as he is suffering a wound to his ego in that Ken is so brutally running down this woman that he has feelings for. He's been making eye contact and looking at throughout the episode. And now they're dismissing her as being beneath them, which they're not exactly a very high standard of partner for anyone themselves.
When Don gets home, Betty's there. She's serving dinner. And he asks how it went. And of course, he already knows that she would have been fired from his job because of his decision. And she fibs to him. So before they were having this honest conversation and she was happy. And here she fibs. She says, well, they were talking about a whole string of possibilities for me. And she says that she decided that she didn't want to work and she makes excuses. She doesn't want him coming home to a mess and Manhattan is harsh and it feels foolish to run around the city with her book. Dawn says, if that's what you want, it's my job to give you what you want. And he's being really sweet in that moment, except he constantly denies her what she actually wants, which is emotional intimacy. I think he's just not capable of it. So instead, there's the house and the jewelry and so forth.
I agree with your observation of the inconsistency here in their relationship, but I love the writing because I think that that inconsistency is so innate to human nature. A scene here where neither of them are really being completely open and transparent and both willingly accepting the fibs and the shading of the other's justifications or commentary. Again, I just such a fan of this scene because I think that is such a reality in so many situations and relationships. It's being done out of a gesture of kindness and love between them. Even though we would say they're not being truthful, I think there's some really sensitive emotions and thoughts of the other's well-being wrapped up in their decision to agree not to shine the spotlight too brightly on what's really going on.
When she says, I don't know what I was thinking, it's so sad. She's giving up on her dream. You expect that Don will brush over it. And instead, to his credit, he takes her hands and he says something really lovely. And it appears to be heartfelt and honest. He says, you have a job, you're mother to those two little people, and you are better at it than anyone else in this world. I would have given anything to have had a mother like you, beautiful and kind. Again, leads with beautiful, but still filled with love like an angel. And she seems genuinely okay. She smiles. And when she hears this, it feels like really they're going to be okay.
Yeah, I read it the same way, and I really feel that that's a huge compliment from Don that is truly heartfelt because one of the huge holes in his life, I think, is the lack of a loving mother, which is probably at the root of a lot of his bad behaviors and his in his relationships with women.
And Dawn adds as they eat together that dinner doesn't seem last minute, and she agrees and smiles and takes credit. She says, no, it's good, isn't it? Just for a minute, she seems happy to be good at her job as the homemaker and a mother.
I'm sure everything works out from here.
If only.
The next scene cuts to breakfast the following morning. The kids go out the door. Betty, says she's gonna go to the community center pool. So it feels like we're settling back into domestic bliss.
Betty says their plan is to go watch them fill the pool at the community center. Like, this is their outing that day. So we see her drinking coffee and doing laundry and sitting alone smoking. This is her homemaker mother life.
And I think it's very deliberate here in the writing to say what could be more dull than watching the community center pool being filled. So although we've wrapped with the domestic bliss from the prior scene, it's clear that this isn't going to work. It's hollow and reality is starting to push its way back in. Just a confession to listeners, my mother never took me to see the community center pool getting filled as a child
And you carry the scars.
to this day.
We notice that Betty is still in her robe in the afternoon. At one point, she and the kids and the dog go outside. What did you think about this scene?
It's such an iconic scene in the series. She's got the cigarette hanging out of her yap. We see the pigeons flying by. It reminds of the incidents that have happened. And suddenly we see Betty's got the BB gun with her and she starts to rack it and shoot at the pigeons, which the neighbor notices and yells, Mrs. Draper, what are you doing? As she pops off BB after BB at the innocent pigeons taking flight.
She's handling it. This is her job, and she will be fierce at it.
As Weiner says in the commentary, she's depressed, but she's also going to protect her family. She's the lioness, and I think that about sums it up. Especially there's one overhead shot of Betty from above, and the cigarettes hanging out. She's got a cold, determined look in her eyes, and she's sighting down the BB gun.
The closing song, My Special Angel, was recorded by Bobby Helms in 1957, and it plays as Betty aims her gun at the neighbor's birds. We've talked before about a rough situation Betty has with societal expectations. Being an angel as your job description likely means you don't have your own feelings or interests or needs. Our double dip question for our listeners this episode is, do you think if Betty had continued modeling that she would have been happier in her marriage to Don? We're very interested in hearing your insights, so all of our listeners are invited to send us your thoughts at madmenctz.com. We appreciate hearing your insights, and we'll share them on a future episode.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctz.com, to vote for your favorite sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at madmenctz, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.